Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll be talking with Theda Skopal, Vincent Pons, and Stephen Soliva-Hare. The midterm elections are behind us. Now what? Join us as these experts to discuss the outcome of the midterm elections and what it means for voters and the 2024 presidential election. In the interest of time, as we introduce these speakers, we will only share their current role and research. For more extensive bios about each speaker, please visit their personal website, which will be shared in the chat. Stephen Soliva-Hare is the Frank G. Thompson Professor of Government at Harvard University. He is an expert in public opinion and elections and has published extensively on elections, mass media, and the representation, political economy, and public opinion, especially concerning energy and the environment. Theda Skopal is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University. Skopal's work covers an unusually broad spectrum of topics, including both comparative politics and American politics. Theda's research focuses on U.S. social policy and civic engagement in American democracy, including changes since the 1960s. Vincent Pons is an associate professor of business administration in the business, government, and international economy unit at Harvard Business School. Vincent studies questions in political economy and development. His research studies democratic representations to understand why representative democracies can fail to deliver leaders, policies, and economic outcomes aligned with people's preferences. Dustin Tingley is the Professor of Government. He is also Deputy Vice Provost for Advances in Learning, Faculty Director for the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning Data Science and Technology Group, and Faculty Director for the Harvard Initiative on Learning and Teaching. His research has spanned international relations, international political economy, climate change, digital education, and data science, with most focused now on the politics of climate change. Thank you for joining us. And with that, Dustin, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much and welcome everyone. I'm really excited for Red, Blue, and You. So we have a tremendous lineup of scholars here to talk about the recent election here in the United States. I want to remind participants that we will definitely be taking questions. So there's a little Q&A button that you could put questions into. Put them in there. I'm going to be monitoring it and getting those questions out to our panelists. Theda, I wanted to start with you as someone who is probably one of the most foremost experts around issues of social movements and political change. How did you see this election and the sort of results that are now coming in?
Right. It's an election that isn't over yet, and its effects are going to reverberate. But I think the most striking feature of it is that we would have expected the sluggish economy and high inflation to produce a national pattern of tied toward the Republicans, particularly since they were the out party, the Democrats are in the presidency. And that's not exactly what happened over the past week. I think in retrospect, it turns out that the idea of rights being taken away, which in a way is not just about abortion, but it could be about voting rights, and the sense that there were extremist options, the correct sense that there were extremist options at the edge of the Republican Party that were pushing in the direction of the use of violence and threats of violence and overt promises not to count elections, not to administer elections in a nonpartisan way. Those turned out to be decisive on the edge, particularly in the swing states that various groups and the Democrats in the end targeted with that kind of message. Which carried more punch than I think most of the prognosticators, either academic or in the polling world, had assumed. That said, it's being presented now in a triumphalist way by some Democrats and commentators as the defeat of Trumpism, and it's no such thing. It's a serious brushback, 5 to 8 point disadvantage for those Trump aligned Republicans who talked about the election of 2020 as being stolen and were promising to help steal future elections. They were the ones repudiated across the board for Secretary of State elections and governor elections and some, and I think it mattered in the senatorial contests as well in key states. But as the victory of DeSantis in Florida shows, and a lot of support for other fairly hard right Trump-oriented Republicans in many red states, Trumpism is alive and well in the more general sense within the bounds of the political system. So we're going to be headed to a period of stasis and conflict, further stasis and conflict in the federal government, and a real war inside the Republican Party, because most of the Republican Party's donors and elected politicians want to have Trumpism without Trump, but Trump himself does not want to have Trumpism without Trump. And he has a pretty loyal grassroots following out there that will not easily move away from him.
Great, thanks for that, Theda. Vincent, you've studied, elections in a broad array of contexts and also done, really path-breaking work on issues of trust. What's your reaction? Where are you coming in on all this?
So I think where perhaps I have things I can contribute is about the campaign itself that preceded the election, and also what we can expect for the next 2 years. So when it comes to the campaign, in my view, there are multiple aspects of the campaign that are reasons for concern about the state of US democracy. And here, I say this from the point of view of non-US citizens. So as an observer living in the US, but coming from another country. The first reason for concern is that there is in the US a very long-standing tradition of holding debates between candidates, of candidates opening town hall meetings. This was admired by Tocqueville when he visited the US. And instead this time, there were multiple candidates, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, who said they wouldn't debate with their opponents. They wouldn't have public meetings open to everyone. Which I find concerning because in principle, one would expect election campaigns and democracy more broadly to be not just about counting the strengths of different sides, but also about deliberation. And campaigns should ideally be a moment in which voters can discuss about social, economic, environmental issues of the day. They can ideally evaluate the merits of the remedies proposed by the different parties on these issues. And occasionally, you would even imagine that they might change their vote intention and perhaps their policy preferences on some of these issues. I think that's key for voters to cast informed votes. It's key to choose good political leaders. It's key for the country to reach a broad consensus on important questions. But I'm afraid that in the climate of polarization that we witnessed in this election, and with candidates refusing to debate, this deliberation is less likely to happen. I had done some research to assess how many people make up their mind in the last 2 months before the election in the US, but also in other countries. And overall, I found that about 17% to 29% of voters change their mind in principle during the last 2 months. In the US, however, only 1/3 of that total change their mind, so 5 to 10%. And I'm worried that this might decrease. The second reason for worry, in my view, is the fact that there's polarization today, not only on policy, not only affective polarization, where people hate voters on the other side, but also disagreements on the very rules of the political game, to the point that people don't trust the results of elections anymore. And I read some worrying numbers suggesting that still today, a majority of Republicans continue saying that they believe that Donald Trump was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election. So again, a second worrying side for the state of US democracy. Now, I think there are also silver linings. The first is that there was strong participation, expected to be around 47%, which is almost as high as in 2018 and much higher than in the midterm elections before that. And the second, I think, reason for optimism is that, as Theda mentioned, many people seem to have voted in defense of democracy. In many states, for key positions, there were election deniers, so people who denied that Biden had legitimately won the last election, who were defeated. And so one may hope that perhaps in the future, candidates will think twice before contesting the legitimacy of the vote of the people. And if you would allow me, I also have some thoughts about what this election tells us for the next 2 years. In political science, there's a conventional idea supported by a lot of research that divided governments, meaning a government when you have a president from one party, such as Biden from the Democratic Party, and at least one chamber of another party, that these divided governments can work sometimes as well as united governments. And famous examples include, for instance, under Bill Clinton, bipartisan reforms that took place on social benefits and agreeing to increase the minimum wage. But I think in view of the campaign, I'm not so optimistic for the next 2 years. I see at least 3 reasons to be skeptical. The first is all the polarization, these candidates refusing to debate during the campaign. That's the first. The second is, if we look at the previous 2 years as an indication, there was little successful bipartisanship. There was a little bit for the infrastructure law, a little bit on Ukraine, but that starts faltering, with Kevin McCarthy mentioning that the US can't continue writing blank checks to support Ukraine. And there was no bipartisanship, for instance, on climate, with no Republican senator voting for the Inflation Reduction Act, which was essentially a climate law. And the third reason for skepticism, I think, is the fact that each majority will be very slim. In the Senate, it is going to be 50-50 or 51-49. For the Democrats, so the House, it will be a slim majority for the Republicans. And so within each party, you might have a very small fraction of senators or House representatives that prevent reaching a consensus within the party and therefore implementing successful policies. So my prediction, if I may make one, is that we won't see much in terms of major policies in the next 2 years. It looks like the Fed will be perhaps one of the main policy actors, deciding whether to continue having a high interest rate in order to combat inflation or to lower the interest rate to prevent an economic crisis. So it looks like policy is going to go away from the political sphere, and instead that the landscape might be dominated by partisan politics, with on one side a president that is strengthened by the results of the election that are not so bad as one would have expected, but will face investigations by House Republicans on his policy on Afghanistan and on his family. And on the other side, a former president, Trump, who is not defeated, but certainly weakened and has a formidable rival in his party that emerged with DeSantis, who won his re-election for governor of Florida with a 19 points margin, which is much more than the 1 percentage point margin with which he had won 4 years ago.
Great, thanks for that, Vincent. Steve, I want to pass it over to you. And Steve, you've been in the business of analyzing elections for a long time, and helping organizations call elections and whatnot. So what's your reaction?
On elections, I work for CBS News, and on the morning of the election, just to put this in context, the other analysts there were expecting the Democrats to lose, say, 3 seats in the Senate, maybe 2. An average midterm election, and this was kind of a below average in terms of the economy and the president's popularity, an average midterm election would be a 4-seat loss in the Senate. And there were some really close races, like New Hampshire looked super tight in the polls, in some polls, not all polls. And then an average midterm election, the incumbent president's party loses 25 seats in the House. So the fact that we're not looking at Republicans with a 3-seat or 4-seat majority in the Senate and a much different constellation in the House, a kind of more comfortable majority is what's surprising. As others have said, the margins were extremely tight. This could have tipped one way or the other with a little luck in some parts of the community for the Republicans or not. So if they did a little bit stronger in the Midwestern suburbs, we could be looking at a different election outcome, or the Western suburbs. The other thing that's worth noting is that this is the first House election since redistricting, and the prior decades redistricting, most assessments showed, benefited Republicans. That is, if you had a really close election like we had this year, Republicans would gain more seats than 50-50, simply because of the way the lines had been drawn in 2012. There's a very nice paper out by my colleague Kosuke Imai and a set of his graduate students showing that the redistricting process, reforms of the redistricting process, court cases and so forth have pretty much eliminated those structural advantages that come from gerrymandering. There's a little bit of an advantage the Republicans enjoy from the over concentration of Democrats in central cities. Like if you're in the middle of New York, it's hard to draw districts going out of New York to benefit the Democrats. So most of those problems got eliminated, and that might be why there was a little less of a swing toward the Republicans than we saw. The explanation for this election is going to have a lot of commentary. There are a lot of forces going on, including the economy and the president's approval in one direction, rights, extremism, public policy successes of the Biden administration going in another direction. There were some very interesting pushes, like white men were in the exit poll, white men were actually more Democratic than one would have expected given the swing in the vote. And Hispanics were more Republican than we expected given the swing in the vote. So the groups are moving in different ways. It's a much more complicated picture, even though everything seemed to have stayed the same. So there's a lot of shifting going on underneath the surface that is really worth paying attention to as we think about 2024. In terms of 2024, I think everybody's watching Trump's decision, but I think the other decision that's very important here is Biden. What is Biden going to do? And there was a lot of speculation before the election that Biden would make clear his intentions after the midterm. So I think that's a thing to watch. The Democrats have to be extremely happy with this midterm election because a number of governors, Democratic governors who would be the natural candidates to succeed Biden or even potentially challenge him, won, in particular, Whitmer in Michigan, Polis in Colorado, Josh Shapiro winning in Pennsylvania, all states that they need in the presidential electoral calculations to hold. And that's good news for the Democrats in terms of the potential candidates who could succeed Biden. As was mentioned, the Republicans have a very strong candidate in DeSantis. Rubio did very well this election, as did Greg Abbott in Texas. Those look like the main successors to Trump, and I'm sure there are others, but those are certainly the strongest coming out of this election. I think the big interesting question that we as political scientists face immediately is like, how is the government going to govern over the next 2 years? The last time we had a Congress this close, well, there were two in the 20th century. One was Eisenhower's first Congress, was a very narrow margin, about the same as what it looks like now. And in 1916, we elected a Republican majority by 1 seat. Those are not years that we look back and think of like, oh, great agenda changes occurred in those years. But Congress still has to get stuff done. It still has to pass a budget. And it's struggled over the past 2 decades to get budgeting done. I expect it's going to be a struggle again. Biden's already signaled that he's open to making deals. He's open to negotiating. And what it might take is a number of centrist Republicans moving over and voting with the Democrats, or a number of centrist Democrats moving over and voting with Republicans to make those deals happen. And it all depends on how strong the progressive left is going to maintain its coalition, and the Freedom Caucus is going to maintain its coalition inside the Republican Party, or whether they're willing to deal. If there's one bill that I am watching, it's the Farm Bill. In 2014, we shut down the government over the Farm Bill. It is due for reauthorization this year. It is a massive social welfare program because it provides for poor support in the form of what used to be called food stamps. it also has a pretty substantial benefit to corporate farms and family farms in the form of crop insurance. The resolution that was reached last time only came about because Obama and the Republican leadership had a stare down. It's a different political constellation, but I think that's the bill to watch to see, are we going to go down the same pathway, or is this new constellation of Republicans and Democrats and Biden going to forge some new way of dealing with legislation that really has to be passed? Because it's going to be very bad if the Republicans try to kill food stamps again, because that ended up blowing up in their face and shutting down the government. And it's going to be bad for the Democrats if they don't somehow get legislation passed on this. This and a few other bills, I think, stand out as things that they have to do this next 2 years. The Farm Bill, I think, is the one to watch, though.
Great. Steve, thanks for that. Theda, I want to come back to you and thinking about social movements and drawing on one of the great questions that's already in the Q&A, which is thinking about the role of social movements. One of the striking social movements of the past couple of years has certainly been the kind of big lie social movement, if you will, which looks a lot different than, say, like the Tea Party, which your fabulous book goes into great detail on. Two questions there. One is there any evidence that those who had sort of endorsed or been a part of that movement might be coming back to reality, or is it simply people really haven't changed their minds, but you had swing voters that kind of put people sort of over the line? What's your prediction about the future of the Stop the Steal social movement?
Well, I don't think it is fundamentally different from the Tea Party. I think these things are an evolution. I think one of the things that Trump did was to create a focal point and an expansion point for what was before that Tea Partyism. And I think, I don't know what's going to happen about the Stop the Steal argument. I think Trump will have to send some cues, but those folks don't. I've been out talking to people in the field. Actually, I was after Trump was elected, not just during the Tea Party period, and they don't really believe that the votes aren't accurate. They believe that certain people shouldn't have a say. And that split between people who live outside of metropolises or college towns and the rest, and the kind of dividing line is in the outer suburbs, that's alive and well. And it's also replicated across many states. So I think the sense that that the future of the country is at stake, and that you've got to get behind politicians who are going to restrict the voice of people who shouldn't have too much voice in America's future. And the immigration issue, these are alive and well and will be stoked again. I do want to say that I somewhat, I see the Farm Bill thing. I think there are a lot of cards in Biden's hands on that. I think we should look at the debt limit. And I don't believe there's any parallel whatsoever between the Democratic Party left and about a third of the Republican caucus, or a half if you want to count it differently, who are in blow it all up mode. I think there's a real danger that the debt limit might not be increased. I think the Democratic Party left took a beating in this election. I'm just going to point to the fact that just a month ago, Bob Kuttner was writing just scorched earth against moderate Democrats who were trying to bring along independents and Republicans. How does that look now? And there's just an asymmetry in the scope of these extremes in the two parties and the leverage they have. And they both, in a way, took a defeat here, but I can tell you right now that the right doesn't take defeats. They get up and fight again, and they're going to. So the final thing I'll say, because I have to go before too long, I don't think it matters if big policy doesn't happen. I understand we're at Harvard University and we all think policy is what government is about. So much policy has passed. Really big policy things have passed in the last 2 years. And there's still the implementation of Obamacare, which is ongoing and now more unquestioned. the whole country may be relieved if there's less policy made in the next 2 years. And the Republican Party in the House is going to put on a display of craziness that is going to be a blessing for the Democratic Party going into 2024. I don't say that with any pleasure. I would rather it didn't happen, even though in my citizen capacity, I'd like to see the Democrats prevail. But I just don't think that Kevin McCarthy or whoever else ends up with that 2 to 4 vote majority in the House is going to be able to control that circus in any way, shape, or form. And the only thing they're going to do is hold a lot of hearings. We're going to hear about Hunter Biden ad nauseum, and I just don't think that's going to go over with middle America.
Yeah, it was interesting, you know, Mitt Romney coming out and very publicly hoping that that's not the direction, but
yeah, well, we know how much sway Romney has in the Republican Party.
Yeah, no, that's right. Theda, one last question for you, because again, I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes. You know, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A about Florida and what that portends. Including, you know, is this an issue with the Democrats on the Hispanic vote and where that's going? You know, the Hispanic vote is obviously very interesting from a kind of a moral side and you know, certain religious values, but also, you know, a variety of preferences around things like immigration. What's your characterization of what's happening in Florida, and whether that's truly going to help DeSantis be a contender, or is all of the Trump DeSantis talk kind of, you know, doesn't really matter?
Well, I mean, I'll say, first of all, I don't think there is such a thing as the Hispanic vote. I think there are many different streams of Hispanic recent arrivals or earlier arrivals. They're behaving differently in different pockets of the West. Partly it depends on if there's a strong union movement with them. The Florida groups are, you know, you could say Florida is a country full of immigrants, because even the old people come in waves, and then a wave dies off and you get the next wave. And so I think Florida is kind of out of reach for Democrats right now. But I would sound a note of caution about how much of a triumph DeSantis will be able to transfer from Florida to the rest of the country. He has a Caudillo style of Trumpism that has gone over very big in a state that really has a lot of dynamics, demographic and cultural and political, that are not necessarily going to sell across the Midwest or even the West, where there are different Hispanic populations. On the other hand, I do want to say I buy the idea that there's a real dilemma here for Republicans, because I don't expect Donald Trump to step back. You know, there's a personality there. On the other hand, he's a much more entertaining and much more attractive person than Ron DeSantis. Wait till we see Ron DeSantis on TV all the time. So I just wouldn't, maybe somebody other than those two will emerge in 2024, but it's not going to be an unturbulent process. It's going to be a real show.
Great, thank you, Theda. Vincent, I want to come to you and ask a great question from the Q&A, which is about more on the primary side, which is, what is the Democratic Party learning, or what could it learn from results in states where it supported extremely conservative Republican candidates in the primaries? Is that, you know, that was kind of a interesting playbook, if you will, where the Democrats kind of came out and said, hey, let's get the Republicans to really elect these extreme candidates. Is that a strategy that makes sense in the long run? Do you think that we're going to see more of that, less of that? What do you think of it as a strategy to begin with?
I don't know how I feel about this strategy. It doesn't seem, it seems like a very perhaps effective strategy that can be effective. Indeed, you support an extreme candidate on the other side, so that mechanically your own candidate will appear closer to the median voter. But it doesn't feel very democratic to try and interfere like this in the primary of the opposite side. So my gut feeling doesn't feel very happy about that practice. I did want also to go back to one of the things that Teda mentioned regarding the negotiation of the debt ceiling. This is a very strange thing for Frenchmen living in the US, that basically in the US, congressmen have to vote twice on the budget. Like first they have to vote on the budget, and then they have to vote again in case there's a deficit to allow to raise the debt limit. It's true that there's a risk associated with that, and I think what can be expected is that Republicans might negotiate, and they might say that they will only agree to raise the ceiling in exchange for some policies that otherwise they would not manage to pass. For instance, they might negotiate for some budget cuts in social benefits or in healthcare. And one reason why they might also be able to get those is that in the current period with relatively low unemployment, high inflation, the time is not a time that is pushing Democrats to advocate for more spending. And so they might get away with this type of arguments. But of course, it's concerning from the point of view of US economic policy, but from the point of view of the entire world, because the entire international financial system hinges on the possibility of buying riskless assets, which are treasury bonds, debt issued by the US government. And if that possibility disappears because the US reneges on its debt and refuses to pay just because the debt ceiling was not increased, then the international financial system might be weakened, and there might be a very deep crisis. So in a sense, this goes back to your previous question, which is that this is another strategy that feels very unpleasant, in the sense that for political gains, you would hold hostage the international economy.
Theda, let me come to you with a question, and then I'm coming over to you, Steve, in a second. Theda, there are a number of questions that we're getting in the chat about some of the sort of newer institutional reforms in some of the states, ranked choice voting, open primaries. We're still learning, I think, a lot about what the impact of those things have been. Any sort of takeaways for you thus far on those changes in how we conduct democracy?
Well, I'm going to state the Scotchpole principle from historical institutional work over 40 years. And that is procedural reforms always ultimately backfire on those who advocate them successfully. But I do think that ranked choice, depending on the context, can be a moderating influence. And it will be and has been in both Alaska and Maine this time around. Steve knows a lot more about the ins and outs of, say, the top two. It is my understanding that some of the reforms in the extreme gerrymandering, for example, in Michigan, have made for a somewhat more representative system. And that's not the same thing always as moderation. So I would make a distinction there. I don't really think very many procedural reforms are going to happen. I think a lot of time is spent talking about revising the US Constitution, getting rid of the Electoral College, packing the Supreme Court. And I just turn it off when that comes on, because I don't believe any of that's going to happen. I'm in the Bill Belichick, New England Patriots school. You find out what the referee's bias is and you win the game anyway.
Steve, let me bring the same question over to you.
I think Nevada passed ranked choice voting this time on an initiative, so we'll see some more of it roll out. Our colleague Eitan Hirsch at Tufts has a nice paper basically showing that ranked choice voting doesn't seem to have many of the effects that it's claimed by advocates, doesn't help minorities more than not, doesn't seem to create some of the candidacies that people expect. We don't have enough cases to observe yet to see whether it has a moderating influence, and it does seem to be highly contextual, which is why on average it seems to kind of wash out what's really going on. That said, NVRA passed in the mid-90s, and it's pretty clear that, and then after 2000 there were a bunch of reforms opening up access to voting, in particular opening up absentee and early voting, which didn't really exist before. And those are things that there's been a big fight among voting rights and civil rights groups over improving access to the vote and trying to use these new ways of voting more effectively. And the fact that absentee voting was liberalized in 2000 was very important for just having any election at all during COVID. So I think these are big changes that have happened over the last 20 years. More people are registered than ever before. And I think that's been not an immediate effect of NVRA, but a long-term effect. More people are using these other modes of voting, like absentee and early voting rather than election day voting. That's had some peculiar effects on election night and the processing of elections. Like the reason it's taking us a whole week before we know who's won elections is because we are now in a world where half of all votes are coming in after election day or on election day through the mail. And it's just a lot more for election administrators to sort out. So in terms of the nuts and bolts practical side of elections, a lot of these reforms have made it more complicated and forced us to slow things down. Maine second has not been called, and the Alaska at-large seat has not been called, and the Alaska Senate seat has not been called because the ranked choice voting system has to kind of work through the process of reallocating the votes to the other candidate. So all of these things then require more patience on the part of us, or create more drama, a whole week of drama that we get to plug into and talk about. But it is changing our expectations about what an election is, when it happens, how it happens. And it does create some pressure points that I think were the center of the controversies last time, because it's no longer one stream of votes that we can look at, because it's these multiple streams of votes. There's more points and places where we can be suspicious of whether the election's being done properly. And I think that is a long-term risk that the electoral administration world has to kind of come to grips with and manage. That's not something that's going to be done at the federal level. That's because of the nature of federal law concerning elections. That's got to be done state by state, very piecemeal, very fragmented, which I think will be frustrating for us going forward. But it is a very important segue to like what 2024 is going to look like. I think it's going to be another long wait to resolve this. There's going to be a lot of complicated streams of ballots that might be contested again.
So in other words, as someone who has a side hustle in calling elections, you've got a lot of job security ahead of you.
Exactly.
Vincent, I want you to. Vincent,
yeah, could I say a word about ranked choice voting?
Yeah,
briefly?
absolutely.
Yeah. So in my view, this type of reforms has the right motivation, which is that one of the reasons why there is extreme polarization in the US, much more than in other countries, is, I think, the two-party system, which itself results from the single round plurality rule elections. If you have only one vote in only one round, then as a voter, you might be unwilling to spend it on a candidate that has very low chances, and therefore you're going to vote for one of the two top parties. But if you, in equilibrium, only have two parties, then perhaps any outside force that might drive polarization might have more strength. Because these two parties can easily grow apart, develop different identities, and distrust or hatred towards the other side. So the idea of ranked choice voting is, okay, let's create a space so that perhaps candidates might emerge in the center, and voters may be willing to vote for them because voting for them doesn't mean losing their vote. Now it's true that, as Steve said, we haven't seen these results yet, but perhaps it's a bit too early to make a final call, because you might imagine that it takes some time for voters to learn how the system works, especially since they have this long habit of bipartisanship, and it might take some time for new types of candidates to emerge. In a sense, the fact that the elections with ranked choice voting have run relatively smoothly, even though there's this delay in counting the ballots, is in and of itself, I think, a happy reason for optimism. And one could expect that you need ranked choice voting to be adopted in more states for habits to change and for perhaps durable changes in the national party system, in the federal party system to take place. Perhaps it's not enough to implement it in isolation. It's just one or two states.
Mm.
So one of the
Well,
questions in
Go,
the
Steve.
chat, one of the questions in the chat is like, what are the prospects for a third party? And ranked choice voting would kind of open the space for that. So one of the things to watch is like, are we going to see third parties emerge in Nevada? Maine and Alaska were places that already had third parties, even under the plurality rule system, or independents. Like Maine had an independent governor and an independent senator. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Nevada and any other places where ranked choice voting comes into being. But the particular political constellation we have right now might be really ripe for a third party. Like if it gets like, there's a possibility of 217, 218. If it's 217, 218, any one member who decides to defect from the speaker vote can really affect things. So there's a possibility of a moderate party in this context. Whether it happens, I think, is a longer shot, but it's certainly, this is about as good a context as you would get. There's been a lot of talk among people who are now outside of politics, but were inside of politics about forming such a third party. They always seem a little odd, like, oh, this is kind of maybe more of a Republican party, or this is more of a Democratic party. So I haven't heard a really true kind of middle third party yet, but this is the context in which I think it has its best chance of arising. If it got like, if we had 50-50 in the Senate, and it looked like this on election night, I was like, oh my God, we're gonna get it. It's like a political scientist's dream. We're gonna have a 50-50 Senate and a 218, 217 House, and every single member of Congress is gonna be pivotal. Every single we're going to have 535 Joe Manchins and Kirsten Sinemas, but like looks like we're a little bit off it. But even still, this setting is particularly volatile for one or two people to break away from their party and realign things. And that's kind of the interesting thing to watch. Manchin and Sinema could do this in the Senate if they had a set of people in the House. They would have to be House Republicans at this point who would be willing to do it on the Republican side.
Let's talk about the Senate for a second. So obviously the big Senate race that we won't know for some time now is in Georgia. Any thoughts about what's going to happen there? And furthermore, will it actually matter for anything, given that procedurally the Democrats are going to control the Senate as it currently stands? Does that race really matter for the sorts of outcomes we'll see in the next 2 years, or is it it's sort of doesn't really matter too much? Steve?
Well, I think having 51-49 is a big difference from 50-50 in the Senate. Huge difference to have that little buffer so that one person isn't stopping things. So that's going to be key for the Democrats. But Vincent, what do you think the campaign's going to be like in Georgia over the next month?
So, I mean, Georgia is interesting. We were talking about different voting rules, and this is one of the rare cases in which you can have a runoff election, which feels very familiar because in French elections, all elections have 2 rounds. And so I'm like suddenly back into like a known territory. But one thing that French elections have told us actually about these elections is that whoever comes first in the first round, even if it's with a very small margin, and this was a very small, very, very close election, whoever comes first in the first round is much more likely to win the second round. And the reason for this is that these candidates are better able to mobilize their base. Just because they were labeled first, they are better able to persuade, here in that case, the 2% of voters who voted for another candidate. And there's a little bit of a bandwagon effect where voters like to be on the winning side, and this candidate is more likely to appear as a winner. So of course, I will not like make a prediction about the final results, but if I had to make some, to anticipate a little bit, I would expect that having been ranked first will favor the Democratic candidate over Herschel Walker. And on top of that, I should say that the bandwagon effect in that case might play in two ways. First, in that particular state, looking at the results of the first round is going to favor the Democratic candidate. But on top of that, everyone will know that the Senate is going to remain with the Democrats. And therefore, this might also generate a bandwagon effect of its own. I agree with Steve that it's a very different landscape if you are at 50-50 and any senator can be like Joe Manchin and can prevent a policy on climate change like it was the case in the first 2 years to be implemented for a very long time and can extract many goods for their state in exchange or many carve-outs. So it's very different if you have this situation than if you are at 51-49, where you would need at least 2 senators to coordinate on their requests to prevent a policy from otherwise being implemented.
You know, it's interesting, Vincent, you kind of leaned into the bandwagoning effect here pretty centrally. You know, an alternative is that, you know, now that Democrats know that the Senate will be you know, barely held, but still held by the Democrats, aren't there implications for turnout?
Yes, so Democrats might feel, might demobilize. It's hard to know. I think, you know, theoretically, we can have intuitions of which way it will go, but it's hard to understand on net where the demobilization will be stronger. One view is Democrats know that they will keep the Senate no matter what, and therefore why bother voting? Another is that the Republicans know that no matter what, the Senate is lost, so why bother voting? So which of these two effects will dominate is difficult, and it might also depend on what happens in the next few weeks. For instance, one important piece of information that voters didn't have when they were voting for the midterm on November 8th, and that they will have, obviously, when they vote, I think on December 6th in the runoff, is that inflation has started slowing down. And inflation was one of the main reasons why the Republican Party was expected to perform well. So imagine if that report on inflation slowing down had emerged before the November 8th election, perhaps Democrats would have had a higher showing, and this might also serve them for that particular runoff.
Got it. Thanks for that. Steve, one of the concepts that people sometimes talk about is candidate quality. And we have a question in the chat that's about this, which is, you know, Herschel Walker was quite a football player, but you know, leaving sort of ideological or policy preferences aside, it's hard to say that he is a sort of a high quality political candidate. Had a lot of sort of things in the closet that made it, you know, kind of challenging, and he still did, you know, relatively well. How is it that we're getting situations in which, you know, it seems like our usual considerations of candidate quality might not matter all that much? In other words, how did he become such a strong candidate?
Well, it's tempting to just focus on one case or one example, but candidate quality has a bunch of different components. One is like extremism is a kind of component of candidate quality, and having like relatively more extreme candidates might make them less electable in a moderate constituency, for example. Celebrity status, just being known, and that's something that Walker brought to the table. But scandals are another problem. Like that's something that dragged him down. So he had a bunch of things pushing in different directions, as do all individual candidates. So when this has been actually subject of some pretty interesting study among a new generation of political scientists, but really back in the 70s, people started studying candidate quality pretty intensively and found that it was a pretty important component of voter choice back then. And the recent studies have found that voters care about candidate quality as much as they've ever cared about candidate quality. It hasn't dropped off in terms of what they personally value or even how they vote. But what's happened is, as the parties have become more polarized, the choices become more distinct. And so these differentiations of quality become less important. Where they really matter, though, is in these super close races where it's a little bit one way or the other. As Vincent pointed out, the context in a month is going to be different than the context this month. And that context will have an effect on the election. So with inflation easing, it will be, there will be important consequences. Maybe other things change in the policy or international space that affect it. Maybe other revelations come out that affect the election. So these things are going to matter on the margin, but it's really going to be a competition for those last 2% of votes. So in the last go around, we had 2 runoffs. Loeffler and Warnock both won in runoffs, and those runoffs were extremely highly correlated with the original election. That was the best predictor of what happened in the runoffs, was the previous election. So what's going to happen is it's just going to be a matter of just inches, who can move the dial a few inches, who can appeal to that 2% who voted for libertarians and other candidates.
Great. Vincent, we've focused most of our time on sort of national, federal level elections. Any sort of lessons learned that you've gleaned from any following of state and local races?
I thought you were going to ask me about the consequences beyond the US.
Okay. Well, actually, let's do that. But let me ask Steve really quickly, just because we only have 6 minutes left, about state and local. And then, yes, Vincent, let's close on that excellent line of inquiry. Steve.
So looks like the governor's going to be 26-24, 25-25. So just like the House and Senate, we're very closely divided. But the Democrats had an unexpectedly good year as well there. In Minnesota and Michigan, they won not only the governorships, but both chambers of the legislature, which was something of a surprise. Democrats did very well all the way down the ballot in Arizona. And the Democrats lost the governorship in Nevada. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, but it was a much better year for the Democrats than they expected, and that sets up things like who administers elections and so forth coming into 2024. But there's an anonymous question that I really like that I'm going to throw into this because it's in the mix, which is, what can alums do to ensure election denial doesn't go on? And really, it's just, what can you do to ensure that elections work better? Elections in the United States are basically volunteer run. They're poll worker run. So if you want to do something to make a difference, to make sure things work well and work right, work the polls, become a poll worker. That is my #1 recommendation. You will get to know more about local elections and so forth. Our colleague and friend Eitan Hirsch, who I mentioned earlier, also has an excellent book, just outstanding book, called Politics is for Power. And it's really about how individuals working in communities can just get involved in politics and make a very big difference. So running for school committee, running for city council, even just talking to neighbors and getting them to vote has huge effects that are kind of underappreciated in the way modern political scientists talk about it. Sometimes we get lost in the polling, we get lost in the drama of the election, and that kind of day-to-day involvement in politics is incredibly important and incredibly rewarding.
If I may, I'm also asked this question sometimes by businesses. Being at Harvard Business School, people ask me, what kind of business leader do? And oftentimes the reaction is, please stay away from politics. These are 2 different realms. And there's a lot of skepticism when corporations donate to specific candidates. Perhaps they are taking the decision away from the will of the people. But something that business can do for sure is give paid time to your employees to vote And some businesses have gone one step further and give paid time to their employees to serve as poll workers if they wanted to do it. So I think I completely agree with Steve on that. And to answer the question that I asked myself about the consequences
That's
for
the best type of question.
for foreign policy, I think there's no election in the world that is watched by so many people in so many different countries as the US election, and for a good reason, which is that I think the Democratic and the Republican Party lately have had different views about the role that the US should play in the world, with one party, or at least parts of this party, advocating for an America First strategy, and the other party with Biden that has tried instead to put back the US as an international leader on climate change, on the conflict in Ukraine. And so I think there was a lot of concern about the result of this election. And when we look at the environment, expectations are that the August law by Biden is going to be implemented, and that this will contribute to a great extent to reducing emissions by the US, and therefore enabling the US to also put pressure on other countries to play their part. With respect to Ukraine, I think there are reasons to be a little bit more worried, given the latest statements as the one by Kevin McCarthy that I mentioned before. This is one of the rare areas in which there was bipartisan support in May for sending aid by the US to Ukraine, and now we hear the little music on the Republican side that bad rainy days are coming, a recession might be coming, and we cannot afford anymore. The truth is that the order of magnitude of the financial help that has been sent by the US is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude lower than the type of stimulus that has been implemented locally. And so I think there's hope by many outside of the US that the support for Ukraine is going to continue.
Yeah, and I think it's, as someone who studies foreign policy, foreign policy has been an area where you've seen more bipartisanship than others, and the decline or the increase in partisanship hasn't quite hit that area. But we'll see what happens with things like free trade. Steve and I talk a lot about how the parties are increasingly becoming very similar on sort of things that look a little protectionist, et cetera. So it remains to be seen. So Vincent and Steve, I want to thank you guys so much for a very stimulating conversation. I want to thank Theda, who had to step out a little bit earlier. And most importantly, I want to thank all the people who joined us today, who asked fantastic questions and really made this a great conversation. So Red, Blue, and you, thank you to all of you, and have a great evening.
Thank you all, and thank you to Dustin for stepping in as a moderator at the very last minute. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining.